On August 19, 1942, in the dense shadowed jungles surrounding Taivu Point on Guadalcanal, 2nd Lieutenant Genjiro Imi of the 8th Independent Anti-Tank Gun Company chronicled in his diary the disbelief and anxiety gripping his men. Alongside nearly 1,000 soldiers under Colonel Kona Ichiki's command, Imi had just completed a nighttime landing from Japanese destroyers. Their mission, according to Imperial Army intelligence, was to initiate the recapture of Henderson Field. Reports suggested the defending Americans were roughly 2,000 strong, inexperienced, and easily unsettled, a stark contrast to the battle-hardened Japanese troops who had been victorious across China and Southeast Asia for years. Colonel Ichiki himself had rejected orders to pause for reinforcements. "These are Americans," he reportedly declared to his officers. "We will drive them into the sea before dawn." Yet what awaited the soldiers of Ichiki's detachment was far beyond conventional defeat. The encounter would dismantle every tactical assumption, strategic principle, and ideological certainty the Imperial Japanese Army had relied upon. The jungle, which the Japanese had previously regarded as a neutral backdrop, became an instrument of the enemy. Darkness, once an ally, turned treacherous, and superior American firepower, coordination, and logistics would expose the myth of invincibility cultivated over years of conquest. This profound shift had its origins just 12 days earlier. On August 7, 1942, approximately 11,000 Marines from the U.S. 1st Marine Division landed at Lunga Point in the opening phase of Operation Watchtower, the first American offensive in the Pacific Theater. Led by General Alexander Vandergrift, the Marines' objectives were clear in planning documents: capture the near-complete Japanese airfield, fortify it, and maintain control until reinforcements arrived. Yet the reality of combat on Guadalcanal would quickly prove far harsher. The campaign became one of the most grueling in Marine Corps history, testing endurance, resourcefulness, and sheer human resilience. Guadalcanal itself presented an environment of extreme hostility. Stretching roughly 90 miles in length and 25 miles across, the island's interior was dominated by jagged mountains rising up to 8,000 feet, often shrouded in perpetual cloud cover. The coastal plain, home to Henderson Field, consisted of dense jungle interspersed with swamps and kunai grass, reducing visibility to mere yards. Tropical heat was relentless, and humidity rarely fell below 90%. Insects formed near impenetrable swarms, rivers and streams concealed parasites, and diseases like malaria, dengue fever, dysentery, and tropical ulcers incapacitated more men than combat itself. Despite these challenges, the initial American assault met minimal opposition. On August 7, the Marines found the airfield almost completely abandoned. The Japanese construction crews, numbering 2,200, along with 600 naval personnel, retreated into the surrounding jungle, leaving behind supplies, heavy equipment, and crucially, the airfield. By the next evening, American engineers had begun repairs, renaming the facility Henderson Field in honor of Major Lofton Henderson, a Marine aviator who had fallen at Midway. Within days, aircraft began arriving, establishing a base that would later be known as the Cactus Air Force. The Japanese counter-response was immediate and brutal, inflicting severe losses on American naval forces. The initial landings, which seemed straightforward on paper, had ignited a campaign that would redefine the strategic calculus of the Pacific War. What had begun as a conventional landing operation quickly evolved into a prolonged contest of attrition, with the island's unforgiving terrain and tropical climate as formidable adversaries in their own right. In the darkness of August 9th, Vice Admiral Gonichi Mikawa led a Japanese naval task force composed of 7 cruisers and a single destroyer in a meticulously planned surprise attack. The encounter, later known as the Battle of Savo Island, resulted in a catastrophic loss for the United States Navy. Within less than 60 minutes, 4 Allied heavy cruisers, the USS Quincy, USS Vincennes, USS Astoria, and the British HMS Canberra, were sunk, claiming over 1,000 lives as sailors were engulfed in fire and smoke. The remaining Allied ships retreated, salvaging what supplies they could, but the Marines ashore were left isolated, severely under-provisioned, and facing a reinforced Japanese presence. What Japanese commanders failed to fully appreciate during this early stage of the campaign was the strategic significance of Henderson Field. possession of the airfield equated to dominance over the surrounding waters during daylight hours. From Henderson, American aircraft could strike Japanese vessels within a 200-mile radius, effectively dictating naval operations in the area. While Japan could maneuver at night, ferrying troops and supplies via the so-called Tokyo Express, daylight hours were dominated by U.S. air power. Recognizing this, the Imperial General Headquarters determined that recapturing Henderson Field was critical before the Americans could fortify their position. The task was assigned to Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake and the 17th Army, headquartered at Rabaul. Available forces were limited. The 35th Infantry Brigade under Major General Kyote Kawaguchi was stationed in Palau, and the 4th Infantry Regiment remained in the Philippines. The closest available unit was Colonel Kiona Ichiki's 28th Infantry Regiment, recently relocated from Guam and initially intended for the aborted Midway operation following Japan's defeat in June. Colonel Ichiki, an instructor at a Japanese infantry school, was renowned for his tactical skill, though he was also known for his impulsiveness and unwavering belief in the superiority of Japanese soldiers in close combat over Western troops. Before departing for Guadalcanal, Ichiki received explicit instructions to wait for the full strength of his regiment before attempting to assault the airfield. However, confident in Japanese fighting prowess and skeptical of American capabilities, he disregarded these orders. Reports from China and the Philippines had shaped his view that Western soldiers lacked resilience under pressure and were inferior in hand-to-hand engagements. On the night of August 18th, 6 Japanese destroyers landed 917 men from Ichiki's lead element at Taivu Point, approximately 15 miles east of the American defensive perimeter. The landing was executed without detection, allowing Ichiki to immediately dispatch scouting patrols to gauge enemy positions and strength. One such reconnaissance patrol, operating on August 19th along the coastal path toward Coley Point, encountered American forces under Captain Charles Brush of Company A, 1st Battalion, 1st Marines. A brief but intense firefight ensued, resulting in 31 Japanese casualties. Crucially, documents captured by the Marines revealed the Japanese misjudged the strength of the American contingent. Captain Brush promptly returned to the main perimeter with the intelligence, allowing General Alexander Vandergrift to anticipate an imminent Japanese attack, likely from the east. Vandergrift ordered Colonel Clifton Cates to reinforce the sandbar defenses at the mouth of the river known to the Marines as the Tenaru, actually the Ilu River, though the misnomer persisted in subsequent reports. Cates positioned Lieutenant Colonel Leonard Cresswell's 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines along the riverbank, setting up interlocking machine gun fire to cover the sandbar effectively. Despite these preparations, Ichiki chose to act without waiting for additional intelligence or reinforcements. In the early hours of August 20th, he launched a direct frontal assault across the sandbar. The resulting engagement would become one of the most lopsided victories in Marine Corps history, a stark testament to the lethal combination of terrain advantage, disciplined defense, and miscalculated enemy assumptions. Japanese military strategy during the early stages of the Guadalcanal campaign relied heavily on the concept of spiritual determination and aggressive night assaults to overcome the superior firepower of Allied forces. Colonel Kiona Ichiki was confident that his seasoned troops could penetrate American defenses through boldness and close-quarters combat, where Japanese infantry demonstrated exceptional skill with bayonets and hand grenades. Shortly after midnight, a Solomon Islands scout named Jacob Vuza, who had recently escaped captivity after enduring prolonged torture by the Japanese, reached Marine positions with urgent intelligence. An assault was imminent. Within minutes, waves of Japanese soldiers surged across the sandbar, shouting battle cries, firing rifles, and tossing grenades. They ran headlong into meticulously prepared kill zones. The Marines had strategically deployed MUN 1917 AO Browning water-cooled machine guns, designs that had been refined since World War I, with each weapon capable of firing 600 rounds per minute indefinitely, provided the water jacket remained full. These guns were arranged to provide overlapping fields of fire, ensuring that no section of the sandbar was left undefended. Japanese troops fell in successive waves as the heavy-caliber bullets tore through their ranks. Those who reached the far side faced 37mm anti-tank guns loaded with canister rounds, effectively turning advancing soldiers into shredded targets. The assault continued relentlessly, with multiple waves pressing forward. Some attackers reached Marine positions, triggering brutal hand-to-hand engagements. The defenders used rifles, knives, and even bare hands to repel them. Despite these desperate attacks, the Americans' defensive preparations held firm. The interlocking zones of fire prevented any breakthrough, systematically decimating Ichiki's forces. By dawn, the attack had completely collapsed. Of the 917 Japanese soldiers who had landed at Tew Point, over 800 were killed or mortally wounded. The survivors, primarily from support units left behind at the landing site, disappeared into the surrounding jungle and later reported the disaster to the Japanese 17th Army headquarters. Colonel Ichiki himself was among the dead, though accounts vary. Some claim he led a final charge to the end, while official Japanese records maintain he performed ritual suicide after burning his regimental colors. American casualties were comparatively minor, numbering around 40, combining both killed and wounded. The psychological effect on the Japanese survivors was profound. Captured documents and post-war interviews revealed their disbelief at the annihilation of an entire regiment within a single night. American forces had not reacted as Japanese doctrine had predicted. They did not panic under darkness or collapse when confronted by shouting, charging soldiers. Instead, they allowed the attackers into carefully constructed kill zones, eliminating them with precise, concentrated fire. Analysis of the battlefield and captured equipment exposed the magnitude of American material superiority, which Japanese intelligence had vastly underestimated. Browning machine guns performed flawlessly under continuous fire, and individual Marines carried ammunition quantities far exceeding those of Japanese squads.
Artillery support from both ground and naval units exceeded anything the Japanese could deploy, while the coordinated integration of infantry, artillery, and naval gunfire presented a level of combined arms efficiency the Japanese had never encountered. Despite the setback, Japanese command quickly prepared for a renewed effort to recapture Henderson Field. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto orchestrated a large-scale naval operation. On August 16, 3 slow transport ships departed Truk, carrying the remaining 1,400 troops of Ichiki's regiment along with 500 naval Marines. After one transport was severely damaged during the naval battle of the Eastern Solomons, Japanese commanders abandoned the use of slow transports in favor of fast destroyers. From August 29 to September 4, the so-called Tokyo Express delivered nearly 5,000 soldiers from Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi's 35th Infantry Brigade to Taivu Point using destroyers and light cruisers. This method allowed troops to reach Guadalcanal in a single night, minimizing exposure to American aircraft. However, it came with a critical limitation. Heavy equipment, including artillery, vehicles, and essential supplies such as food and ammunition could not be transported. Consequently, troops arrived equipped only with what they could carry, relying heavily on local resources and whatever supplies could be smuggled through enemy lines. As the campaign progressed, Japanese forces found themselves not only facing overwhelming American firepower, but also severe logistical shortages that increasingly threatened their ability to sustain combat operations. Starvation, lack of ammunition, and limited artillery support compounded the challenges of confronting a well-supplied, strategically entrenched enemy. Every offensive attempt on Guadalcanal would thus be hampered by these inherent logistical weaknesses, shaping the course of the island's grueling campaign. General Kawaguchi set September 12 as the date for his planned offensive against Henderson Field. His strategy involved a coordinated assault along 3 separate axes. One contingent would advance from the western coastal area, another would push through the dense southern jungle, aiming for what Japanese intelligence identified as a vulnerable section of American defenses, and Kawaguchi himself intended. Unbeknownst to him, Marine reconnaissance had already determined that this ridge represented the most probable route for an attack. On September 8, Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson, commanding the 1st Raider Battalion, conducted a raid on Tasimoko village and uncovered extensive Japanese supply depots, signaling the buildup of a significant enemy force. Recognizing the enemy's intentions, Edson immediately requested authorization to fortify the ridge, a proposal that General Vandergrift promptly approved. On September 10 and 11, Edson deployed roughly 840 Marines from his Raider Battalion and the 1st Parachute Battalion along the ridge. He meticulously selected defensive positions, applying the same tactical rigor that had proven effective during the Tanaru River engagements. Machine guns were arranged to provide overlapping fields of fire, mortar teams calibrated their targeting along anticipated enemy approaches, and artillery from the 11th Marines was assigned precise fire missions to cover the terrain. Every natural and constructed advantage was exploited to maximize defensive capability. The ridge itself extended approximately 1 kilometer, consisting of 3 separate hilltops cloaked in kunai grass with sporadic tree coverage. Steep ravines flanked both sides, heavily forested and in some sections nearly impassable, making the terrain ideal for infiltrating infantry under cover of night, but deadly for attackers once properly defended.
As night fell on September 12, Kawaguchi's forces initiated their assault. In contrast to Ichiki's earlier frontal attack, this offensive was more methodical and complex. Japanese infantry moved through the ravines along the ridge's flanks, seeking to encircle Marine positions. Small units probed for weaknesses, and when gaps were identified, larger formations attempted to force breakthroughs. Combat was intense and often chaotic. Under the cover of darkness, Marines frequently engaged in close-quarters combat with Japanese soldiers who had penetrated to grenade range. Despite the ferocity of the assaults, the prepared defenses held. Whenever Japanese forces massed for concentrated attacks, Marine mortars and artillery struck with devastating effect. The 11th Marines fired over 2,000 rounds during the night, with high explosive shells landing perilously close to friendly lines, occasionally causing minor casualties among their own troops. Machine gun crews maintained continuous fire until the heat of their barrels made them glow red. Individual Marines resorted to rifles, pistols, knives, entrenching tools, or any weapon within reach. Sergeant Major Jacob Vare, the same scout who had previously alerted forces to the Tenaru attack, moved through the defensive lines, motivating troops and identifying points of enemy infiltration. Sergeant John Basilone operated a machine gun post that became pivotal to the ridge's defense. When his crew was incapacitated, Basilone continued alone, repelling successive waves of attackers. For his actions, he was later awarded the Medal of Honor. Overall, 2 Marines received the Medal of Honor and 19 were awarded the Navy Cross for their valor during the battle on Edson's Ridge. By dawn on September 13, the Japanese offensive had failed to breach the ridge, though Kawaguchi retained additional forces for a subsequent attack. Edson consolidated his units near the ridge's center, while General Vandergrift dispatched reinforcements, raising the defending force to roughly 2,500 Marines. The Japanese would launch another assault the following night, but by then, the Marines occupied strengthened positions and possessed even greater concentrated firepower. The fighting on the second night escalated to an intensity surpassing the first. General Kawaguchi committed all remaining Japanese troops to desperate assaults, hoping to breach the American positions before reinforcements could arrive and solidify the defense. Waves of Japanese soldiers charged repeatedly, meeting with deadly machine gun fire that claimed hundreds of lives. Some attacks came perilously close within about 50 yards of Edson's command post before being repelled. At one critical moment, the situation became so dire that Edson himself took up a rifle and joined the line of fire. Despite the ferocity of the assaults, American firepower, combined with carefully prepared defensive positions, held firm. By dawn on September 14, Kawaguchi's offensive had completely disintegrated. Japanese losses were catastrophic. Estimates indicate that between 830 and 850 Japanese soldiers were killed in the vicinity of what became known as Edson's Ridge. Marine casualties, though significantly lower, were still severe, with roughly 104 killed and over 200 wounded among the Raider and Parachute battalions. The ridge earned the grim nickname Bloody Ridge, standing as a stark symbol of the effectiveness of U.S. defensive strategies. For the surviving Japanese soldiers, the battle shattered expectations. Diaries and post-war reflections consistently convey a shared sense of shock. They had anticipated night engagements against infantry, relying on training and morale to secure victory, but were instead met by concentrated artillery, machine guns, and mortars coordinated with precision far beyond their capacity to counter. American commanders, fully aware of the impending attacks, had carefully laid out killing zones and waited for the Japanese to enter before unleashing devastating coordinated fire. The engagements at Tenaru and Bloody Ridge set a pattern that would recur across the Guadalcanal campaign. Japanese tactics emphasized courage, night attacks, and skill in hand-to-hand combat, while U.S. forces responded with overwhelming firepower, integrated arms coordination, and defensively advantageous positions. The results were predictable. Japanese forces suffered immense losses, while American forces sustained casualties that, though significant, remained manageable. Yet the numbers alone failed to capture the full horror of jungle combat on Guadalcanal. The natural environment itself acted as a silent but deadly adversary. Malaria struck nearly every man who spent more than a brief period on the island. By December 1942, the 1st Marine Division reported over 8,000 cases of malaria. Tropical illnesses debilitated roughly 2/3 of the division. Skin infections, fungal diseases, and persistent jungle rot caused open, unhealing sores, while dental issues left untreated led to systemic infections. The Japanese endured even harsher conditions. Limited supply lines meant soldiers often lacked adequate rations, relying on scavenged food, and sporadic rice deliveries stretched perilously thin. Starvation became an everyday reality. Medical provisions were scarce. Quinine for malaria prevention was quickly exhausted, and wounded soldiers frequently succumbed to infections that proper care would have easily treated. Captured Japanese records reveal a grim picture. A late October report from a medical officer indicated that more than 60% of the 17th Army on Guadalcanal were incapacitated due to illness or malnutrition. Combat effectiveness had dropped to roughly 30% of authorized strength, and the death rate among troops, primarily from starvation and disease, reached 50 per day. In contrast, American forces benefited from relatively secure supply lines. During daylight hours, Henderson Field aircraft protected transport ships carrying food, ammunition, medical supplies, and replacement equipment. Temporary shortages occurred during periods of naval setbacks, particularly in August and early September, but by October the supply chain had stabilized. Marines consumed canned rations that, while not particularly appetizing, provided sufficient calories and nutrition. Ammunition supplies were abundant, allowing machine gunners to sustain continuous fire until their barrels wore out, with replacements readily available. Overall, the fighting on Edson's Ridge, the extreme environmental challenges, and the stark contrast in logistics underscored the decisive role of preparation, firepower, and supply in the Guadalcanal campaign, highlighting how strategy and conditions could determine survival even as courage and valor confronted overwhelming odds. Medical support for troops included temporary field hospitals equipped for surgery, the use of plasma for transfusions, antibacterial treatments with sulfonamide drugs, and, when feasible, evacuation of critically injured soldiers to more secure rear-area hospitals. Japanese supply lines, in stark contrast, were precarious, relying primarily on materials that could be loaded onto destroyers or smuggled through enemy-held positions. Frontline soldiers had to stretch minimal rations, often making a single rice ball last an entire day, while ammunition was rationed to extreme levels, with firing sometimes limited to the most critical situations. Medical care was rudimentary at best. Some soldiers received only bandages, others faced amputations without anesthesia, and many died from infected wounds. Severely wounded men were sometimes issued grenades to take their own lives rather than slow their units or risk capture. In late October, Japanese forces launched their most ambitious assault of the Guadalcanal campaign. General Harukichi Hyakutake personally traveled to the island to direct operations, bringing reinforcements from the 2nd Division, including troops seasoned by combat in China. The offensive was designed as a multi-pronged assault, with the primary attack pushing from the south through dense jungle, reminiscent of the earlier costly Bloody Ridge engagement. Unlike previous attempts, this operation included larger troop numbers, improved coordination, and artillery support that had finally arrived via destroyers. The initial phase began on October 23 with a Western probe. A small contingent of 9 Japanese tanks, an unusual presence on Guadalcanal due to transport difficulties, advanced across the Matanikau River. American forces, including elements of the newly arrived 164th Infantry Regiment, were prepared. Anti-tank weaponry, artillery, and even an M3 Stuart tank destroyed all 9 Japanese vehicles in rapid succession, resulting in severe enemy losses and the collapse of the attack. The main offensive commenced during the night of October 24-25. Roughly 5,600 Japanese soldiers under Major General Yumio Nasu pushed from the south, aiming to breach the lines near Henderson Field. They met the 1st Battalion of the 7th Marines, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Louis Chesty Puller, bolstered by units of the 164th Infantry. The night battle quickly became a defining moment in Marine Corps history. Japanese waves repeatedly assaulted the defensive positions, but any local breakthroughs were immediately countered. Machine gunners continued firing until their weapons failed, after which they switched to rifles. Artillery from the 11th Marines targeted enemy positions dangerously close to their own lines. The battleship USS Washington remained offshore, prepared to deliver naval gunfire support if necessary. At a critical juncture, only a single Marine battalion prevented Japanese forces from reaching Henderson Field, yet they held their ground. Sergeant John Basilone, already distinguished at Bloody Ridge, played a pivotal role once again. As ammunition ran low for his machine gun section, he personally transported supplies under enemy fire and repaired damaged guns. When one gun emplacement was overrun, he took a .45 pistol and led a counterattack that restored the defensive line. By morning on October 25, the Japanese attack had failed. General Nasu was killed by machine gun fire during the night, and over 2,000 Japanese troops perished in the assault, while American losses numbered in the several hundreds, significant but sustainable. October 1942 also witnessed decisive naval engagements that further shaped the strategic landscape around Guadalcanal. The naval battle, fought over 4 days from November 12-15, featured some of the fiercest surface combat in modern naval history. In a chaotic night clash on November 13th, U.S. cruisers and destroyers engaged a Japanese bombardment force, including the battleships Hiei and Kirishima. Rear Admirals Daniel Callaghan and Norman Scott, the only U.S. flag officers killed in World War II surface actions, died in the encounter. The Americans lost 2 light cruisers and 4 destroyers, and 3 additional destroyers were damaged. The Japanese, however, lost Hiei, which was disabled in the night action and subsequently sunk by airstrikes. Crucially, the bombardment mission failed, leaving Henderson Field operational. During the night of November 14-15, Kirishima attempted another bombardment but was intercepted by USS Washington and USS South Dakota. Using radar-directed gunnery, the Americans fired 9 16-inch shells at ranges where Japanese lookouts could barely see their target, sinking Kirishima with heavy casualties. Concurrently, American air and naval forces intercepted a Japanese convoy attempting to reinforce the island with the 38th Division and its heavy equipment. Of 11 transport ships, only 4 reached Guadalcanal, and all were destroyed before they could unload. These engagements effectively secured American control of the island, preserving Henderson Field and marking a turning point in the Guadalcanal campaign. Japanese losses from the attempted convoy exceeded 5,000 personnel, marking the final substantial effort to reinforce Guadalcanal with a fully equipped ground force. For the troops already stationed on the island, November 1942 signaled a turning point toward inevitable defeat. They had anticipated fresh troops and supplies, but instead, news arrived that naval engagements had ended in failure, the convoys had been annihilated, and no further aid was forthcoming. Food rations, already meager, were further curtailed. Soldiers who were already on the brink of starvation faced even stricter limitations. Critical medical supplies vanished entirely, leaving makeshift field hospitals overwhelmed with sick and wounded men, while physicians were powerless to intervene effectively. Contemporary Japanese diaries captured the dire reality on Guadalcanal. Accounts noted that rice allotments were reduced to a single small portion per day. Disease proliferated uncontrollably. Corpses were sometimes incinerated, but only when the survivors could muster the strength. Soldiers confronted the grim truth: no reinforcements or supplies were coming. Reports described men resorting to eating grass and bark, succumbing to poisonous plants, and deteriorating into emaciated shadows of their former selves. By December, the situation had reached its final stage. The Japanese command in Rabaul secretly decided to withdraw from Guadalcanal, acknowledging that maintaining their position would result in the complete destruction of the 17th Army. Publicly, defeats could not be admitted, but internally, commanders understood the inevitability of evacuation. Approximately 11,000 troops remained on the island, a dramatic decrease from the original peak of around 36,000. Of these, roughly 7,000 were physically capable of marching, while the remainder were debilitated by illness, injuries, or severe malnutrition. Operation K, the withdrawal plan, became one of the Japanese military's most effective operations during the war. Utilizing fast destroyer runs reminiscent of the Tokyo Express, Japanese naval forces successfully extracted 10,652 men over 3 nights in early February 1943. While the execution was notable under challenging conditions, it could not overshadow the scale of the defeat. At its height, the Japanese force on Guadalcanal numbered around 36,000 soldiers. Approximately 25,000 to 30,000 perished, including roughly 14,800 killed in combat and an estimated 10,000 to 15,000 succumbing to disease and starvation. American losses were substantial but sustainable. Marines and Army units involved in the campaign suffered about 1,600 killed in action, 4,200 wounded, and several thousand more temporarily incapacitated by tropical illnesses. Unlike Japan, the United States could replenish these losses rapidly through industrial production and manpower. New divisions were already forming, while ships and aircraft were being manufactured faster than they could be lost. The strategic momentum had decisively shifted in favor of the Allies, and Guadalcanal had a profound psychological impact on Japanese military thinking. For the first time, Japanese forces had been beaten in extended ground combat. Every offensive initiative failed, and traditional Japanese tactical doctrines, once deemed effective, resulted in catastrophic losses. It became clear that American forces were not only better equipped but also tactically proficient, well-led, and capable of enduring extreme hardships. Post-war memoirs and interviews with surviving Japanese officers consistently highlighted key lessons. They admitted they had underestimated American combat effectiveness, misjudged the extent of the disparity in equipment and supplies, and suffered from logistical shortcomings that rendered sustained operations impossible against an enemy with control of sea and air. They realized that courage and tactical skill, however significant, could not compensate for systemic deficiencies in resources and firepower. Veterans recalled that the Americans were highly organized. They had efficient systems for supply, medical care, artillery support, and air coordination. Japanese systems, in contrast, failed because they had been inadequately designed from the outset. First-hand accounts from the survivors also contradicted official Japanese explanations for defeat. They acknowledged that Americans defended prepared positions effectively at night, withstood disease and harsh conditions while maintaining combat readiness, and deployed firepower in a coordinated and devastatingly precise manner. A single American battalion often outgunned an entire Japanese regiment. Technological differences further compounded Japanese difficulties. Guadalcanal forces relied primarily on Arisaka bolt-action rifles, which required manual cycling after each shot. American Marines initially used Mono 3 Springfield bolt-action rifles, gradually supplemented by the semi-automatic Mono Garand, providing significantly greater firepower and rate of fire. Ultimately, the battle demonstrated that superior individual bravery or traditional martial skills could not overcome systemic superiority in logistics, coordination, and sustained firepower. Guadalcanal marked a decisive lesson. Modern warfare is determined by organization, supply, and the ability to maintain operational effectiveness under extreme conditions, not merely the valor of individual soldiers. The Garand rifle with its 8-round clip and semi-automatic firing gave American troops a significant edge in individual engagements. In contrast, machine guns told a broader story about sustained firepower. The U.S. Mooney 1917 Aoni Browning, water-cooled, could maintain continuous fire for as long as water and ammunition were supplied. Japanese counterparts, mainly the Type 96 and Type 99, were designed to be lighter and more mobile, but lacked the ability to deliver prolonged suppressive fire. This disparity became critical in entrenched defensive positions. Artillery superiority further amplified American advantages. The 11th Marine Regiment employed Monet-owned pack howitzers, compact artillery pieces that could be disassembled and carried through the dense jungle terrain. These 75mm guns offered highly responsive and accurate fire support. Forward observers embedded with infantry units could call in artillery strikes and see them impact within minutes. By contrast, Japanese artillery on Guadalcanal was sparse, cumbersome to move in jungle conditions, and frequently suffered from ammunition shortages. Naval gunfire added another decisive layer. Offshore destroyers and cruisers could bombard Japanese positions or provide rapid support for advancing American ground forces. Coordination through radio links between ship-based guns and shore observers allowed pinpoint accuracy, something the Japanese could not match. Air power grew steadily more influential as the campaign unfolded. Operating under arduous conditions from Henderson Field, the Cactus Air Force gradually established dominance over Guadalcanal skies. Pilots from the Marine Corps and the Army Air Forces, flying 4F Wildcats, P-39 Airacobras, and P-40 Warhawks, intercepted Japanese bombing missions. SBD Dauntless dive bombers struck enemy positions, supply ships, and troop concentrations with precision. Japanese aircraft based in Rabaul faced extreme range limitations, leaving little time over their targets. The final American ground offensive in January 1943 underscored the shift in momentum. Major General Alexander Patch's 14th Corps, integrating both Marine and Army divisions, executed coordinated assaults that systematically reduced remaining Japanese strongpoints. The offensive benefited from overwhelming fire support from artillery, naval bombardment, and airstrikes. Despite fierce resistance, Japanese forces were debilitated by disease, starvation, and dwindling ammunition supplies. By February 9, 1943, American patrols confirmed that Japanese units had withdrawn. General Patch famously reported to Admiral Halsey, "Tokyo Express no longer terminates on Guadalcanal." 6 months of combat had produced the first substantial American victory on the ground against Japan. Beyond the immediate tactical success, the campaign exposed fundamental truths that would guide operations throughout the Pacific War. For Japanese forces, the campaign shattered long-held assumptions about battlefield dominance. Individual bravery and tactical skill, previously sufficient in China, could not compensate for systemic deficiencies. Night attacks and close-quarters combat, tactics that had consistently brought success in other theaters, were neutralized by American defensive arrangements. Supply lines and logistics emerged as essential, not secondary, elements of effective combat. Control of the air and sea proved decisive in determining land battle outcomes. Some Japanese officers recognized the implications. Colonel Masanobutsuji, a staff officer who observed the campaign firsthand, concluded that Japan needed a complete strategic overhaul. He noted that the Americans waged an industrial war where production capacity directly influenced victory. Japan, lacking comparable industrial output, could not sustain such a conflict. Yet the Japanese military culture, steeped in centuries of tradition and recent battlefield triumphs, struggled to embrace this reality. Official Japanese explanations for the Guadalcanal defeat highlighted insufficient supplies, naval setbacks, and unexpectedly strong American defenses. They did not confront the deeper truth: Japanese tactical doctrine, which had succeeded in China, was inadequate against a modern, industrially powered adversary. Soldiers who survived the campaign, whether captured or returning home, bore witness to a profound transformation. They entered Guadalcanal confident in the might of their empire, and they left as weakened, disease-ravaged survivors of a devastating defeat. For many observers, the Battle for Guadalcanal represented a pivotal moment in World War II, the point at which the inevitability of Japan's defeat became apparent. In post-war interviews, Japanese veterans often recounted a profound shift in their understanding of the conflict. They realized that the realities of war starkly contradicted the illusions propagated by their leadership. The Americans were far from fragile opponents. They were exceptionally capable across multiple dimensions, not only in the quality of their weaponry but also in logistics, command structures, operational planning, and the ability to sustain prolonged combat. Despite demonstrating remarkable courage and tactical skill, Japanese troops found that bravery alone could not counterbalance the Americans' systematic and resource-backed approach. From the American perspective, Guadalcanal delivered different yet equally important lessons. For the Marines and Army personnel engaged in the campaign, the island was a proving ground that demonstrated American forces could endure the same harshness and ferocity of jungle warfare traditionally associated with Japanese troops. The aura of Japanese invincibility was dispelled. American defensive strategies proved effective, and combined arms coordination, including the integration of infantry, artillery, and air support, functioned reliably under real combat conditions. Properly trained and equipped, individual U.S. soldiers were more than capable of overpowering Japanese units. Nevertheless, Americans also developed a deep respect for the tenacity and discipline of Japanese fighters. Many Japanese soldiers were willing to fight to the death rather than surrender, enduring starvation and extreme hardship in the process. This willingness to continue the fight despite hopeless circumstances left a lasting impression on their opponents. The stark contrast in how each side treated prisoners and approached surrender highlighted broader cultural and doctrinal differences. USW doctrinal differences. Forces attempted to encourage surrender through leaflets, radio broadcasts, and the provision of food and medical aid, but these measures met with limited success. Of roughly 36,000 Japanese troops deployed to Guadalcanal, fewer than 1,000 were taken alive, and most of those were incapacitated by illness or injury. The strategic consequences of Guadalcanal extended far beyond the immediate theater of operations. Japan's failure to retake Henderson Field and the eventual forced withdrawal demonstrated that their defensive perimeter was vulnerable to Allied penetration. This shift in the operational balance allowed the Allies to transition from a defensive posture to a series of offensive campaigns across the Pacific. America's industrial superiority, once effectively harnessed, could produce tangible battlefield victories on a scale that Japan could not match. For Japan, Guadalcanal signaled the onset of an irreversible decline. The loss of veteran personnel, including pilots, sailors, and ground troops, could not be replaced quickly enough to counterbalance American production of new forces. The Japanese decision to withdraw, though unpublicized, implicitly acknowledged that protracted attritional warfare against a well-equipped industrial opponent was unsustainable. The experience of Guadalcanal had lasting psychological and operational effects on veterans of both nations. American Marines and soldiers who survived the island became a repository of knowledge, shaping new units with hard-earned lessons in jungle combat, defensive strategy, and combined arms coordination. The 1st Marine Division, which had fought on Guadalcanal, required extensive rest and recuperation before returning to active duty. Japanese survivors faced an even harsher reality. Those evacuated during Operation Key were redistributed across other Pacific commands, carrying the mental weight of defeat and a sobering awareness of American strength. Many would meet their end in subsequent campaigns as Japan's strategic position continued to deteriorate. Guadalcanal itself bore the physical imprint of months of fierce combat for decades. Scattered wreckage of aircraft, abandoned vehicles, and unexploded ordnance littered both jungle and coastal areas. Henderson Field, expanded and improved during the campaign, evolved into a central Allied base that facilitated further operations in the Solomon Islands. For historians and military analysts, the campaign offers enduring case studies in amphibious assault planning, jungle warfare, logistics, air-ground coordination, and the integration of naval and land operations in a complex combat environment. The battle illuminated not only the operational strengths and weaknesses of both sides, but also the psychological dimensions of endurance, morale, and the human cost of protracted conflict. The Guadalcanal campaign highlighted that success in modern warfare depended on far more than individual heroism or battlefield ingenuity. Victory required a combination of industrial strength, reliable supply chains, technological advantage, and the capacity to maintain sustained operations over long periods. The human toll of the campaign was immense. In naval engagements surrounding the island, over 700 American and Japanese sailors lost their lives. On the ground, American casualties, including those killed, wounded, or missing, also exceeded 7,000, while Japanese losses across all causes surpassed 30,000. Beyond battlefield deaths, countless soldiers on both sides endured disease, injury, and conditions that would affect their health for years to come. Yet, from a strategic perspective, the immense sacrifice was deemed necessary to achieve the broader military objectives. Guadalcanal marked a decisive turning point in the Pacific theater. It signaled the transition of Allied forces from defensive operations to sustained offensive campaigns. The battle proved that Japanese ground forces could be challenged and defeated in direct combat. It also established the patterns of air and naval dominance that would define subsequent engagements in the region. The confrontation between Japanese troops and American forces in the dense jungles of Guadalcanal illustrated a clash of fundamentally contrasting approaches to warfare. One side relied on the traditional warrior ethos, believing that courage, determination, and tactical skill could overcome deficiencies in resources and firepower. The other prioritized systematic planning, leveraging industrial output, logistics, and combined arms coordination to achieve battlefield superiority. The island's jungles became a testing ground for these conflicting doctrines. Over 6 months of grueling combat, the results became clear. A military strategy that integrated concentrated firepower, robust supply lines, disciplined coordination, and capable soldiers consistently outperformed a force reliant on individual bravery and rigid tactical training. For surviving Japanese soldiers, the campaign exposed the limitations of their doctrine. Their pre-war training had not prepared them for the scale or intensity of this modern conflict. Their tactics, designed for different conditions, proved inadequate, and their logistical framework could not sustain prolonged engagements. The realization that their nation's military approach alone could not secure victory was a sobering moment for many. For American forces, the experience offered a different set of lessons. They discovered that they could match Japanese combat intensity, while their industrial capacity allowed them to replace losses and maintain pressure continuously. The campaign provided a foundation for developing jungle warfare tactics and doctrines that would prove essential in later operations. Moreover, the myth of Japanese invincibility was shattered, replaced with a measured understanding of a determined but ultimately surmountable enemy. The fear experienced by Japanese troops was not rooted in the skill of individual American soldiers, who were formidable in their own right, but in the relentless and overwhelming application of material power. Supplies were abundant, medical care for the wounded was reliable, artillery barrages were continuous, air support dominated the skies, and industrial production could replenish losses faster than combat could inflict them. This systemic advantage rendered acts of personal heroism insufficient to change the outcome. Guadalcanal thus represented a fundamental turning point in the Pacific War. From this campaign onward, Japanese forces increasingly found themselves on the defensive, confronted by an enemy whose material and logistical superiority expanded over time. The strategies, tactics, and lessons developed in the jungles of Guadalcanal set the precedent for subsequent Allied operations. They demonstrated that with proper coordination, sustained logistical support, and overwhelming firepower, American forces could prevail even in the most challenging terrain against an adversary trained for relentless combat.